Välkomna till Arkitekturdagarna och till Sveriges Arkitekter på Formdesign Center. Vi genomför dagarna i samarbete med olika partners. Nu välkomnar jag Sveriges Arkitekter Skåne, Skånes lokalförening som värdar för en timme på temat More than enough, Architecture after growth. Moderator är Max Gartel, kommunikatör på Sveriges Arkitekter Skåne. Och varmt välkommen Max.
Tack för det Gunilla. Jag ska inte säga så mycket om oss. Vi är ju den lokala medlemsföreningen och arrangerar ABAR här med jämna mellanrum. Så därför ska jag introducera vår talare idag, Phineas Harper från Storbritannien. Han är författare, kritiker och debattör. Han är också biträdande direktör för The Architecture Foundation som är en think tank som driver arkitekturfrågor i samhällsdebatten. Han har skrivit för ett antal olika tidskrifter. Han har ett startat debattorgan som också på egen hand driver de här frågorna. Han skriver regelbundet för Design, krönikor och har alltid en intressant, humoristisk och normkritisk blick på vår profession och alla dess spår och situationer som den hamnar i. Han har blivit utvald tillsammans med 3 andra att vara kurator för Oslo Arkitektur-Triennale som startar den 26 september i Oslo, så att, det kan vi rekommendera. Och det är kring temat Architecture after growth, och det är som alltså arkitektur efter frånväxt, eller hur man nu kan översätta det här. Och jag fick reda på idag att det hölls en konferens i Malmö på det här temat förra året, så det är uppenbarligen många som forskar i många olika områden, men detta handlar om arkitekturen. So I'll leave the word to you and enjoy the rest of the evening. We'll take questions after the wrapping up, so there will be time for questions. Just have some patience.
Thanks. I'm a typical British person who can't speak any languages other than English, so I have no idea what Max just said, but I assume it was very nice. It could have been really rude. If you are standing at the back and you don't want to be standing, I have good news. There are lots of seats here and here. They say reserved, but there's no one in them. So if you don't want to be standing or you don't want to be really far away, just come forward. Thank you for having me. It's a big pleasure to be here. I've been working a lot with Norwegians over the last 2 years who tell me that you're the fun guys and they're the boring ones. So I hope that's true. My name is Finn. I'm chief curator of the Oslo Architecture Triennale this year. It opens in less than a month. I'm terrified. If you think I look too young to be a chief curator, you have massively underestimated the power of moisturizer. Truly a wonderful thing. So the Triennale is called Enough, and it explores what architecture might be like if we kind of got over this obsession with economic growth that sort of defines society at the moment. But for this talk, I don't want to focus too much on the festival itself and what we're doing, kind of because I don't think I'll be able to compete with the festival itself, which is largely full of literature and theatre and exhibitions. But instead I want to kind of zoom out a little bit and speak more broadly to this kind of wider theme about what we do as makers and thinkers about buildings, and why what we do is kind of worth doing with the very limited amount of time that we have on this planet. I'm going to talk for about an hour, but I'm going to try and make it a fast hour. That is because I think that lectures that drag on are really dull. But it is also because I spent all of yesterday on the train getting here from London by land, and I'm tired. The reason I came by train is kind of pertinent to this whole conversation, because I think it's worth just reflecting on the kind of context in which we find ourselves in, which is kind of like the whole world seems to be finally waking up to a climate emergency. You have NGOs, you have governments, even the British government, who are descending into kind of oblivion and farce, even they have declared a climate emergency. That we live in these kind of extreme times, whether it's the burning Amazon or the melting ice cap, the actions that we take over the next decade or so are going to be felt for generations to come. And I think that's like the context in which we have to think about. Architects have declared an emergency too. This image is taken from Architects Declare, which was this kind of coalition of Sterling Prize winners who came together. I think it was 16 of them, and they said, we declare an emergency, and they unveiled these 11 pledges that they wanted architects to sign up to. And at the time I was writing this lecture, 599 architecture practices had signed up to those pledges. And this kind of movement seems to be gathering pace around the world, not only in architecture, but beyond it. And so the question becomes, what is architecture in an era of climate emergency? How would designers respond seriously if we do believe it is an emergency, if we're sincere about these pledges to such an emergency? And I have good news for you, because it turns out, if you look at architects around the world, all architecture is already sustainable. Ken Yang's tree-festooned headquarters, these are in Kuala Lumpur, are saving the planet by design. So that's nice. Norman Foster's Bloomberg HQ in London, which uses 10,000 tons of sandstone cladding in its facade, is the most sustainable office building in the world. That's nice. Our friend Bjarke Ingels, his power plant, which will puff a ton of carbon dioxide into the Copenhagen air with every few smoke rings, is the cleanest in the world. As it happens, the smoke rings never quite materialized, and instead we have this sort of constant plume of smoke. But it is very clean smoke, apparently. So clearly there's a lot of spin going on here. Clearly there's a lot of greenwashing, a lot of lies. But in a way, I want to take heart from this situation, because as sort of frustrating and as nonsensical as these claims might seem, they can be, I think we can see them as encouraging in a way. Even Bjarke Ingels knows deep down somewhere that buildings should be made in symbiosis with nature. He might not be able to do it yet, but he kind of gets it at some level. We're craving the right things, but we seem unable to translate those things into the real world. And this is ultimately a question of how we think about values. And I've sort of changed the name of this lecture recently, because I sort of took a step back from it and thought, actually, this is all about values, and I've called it The Value of Nothing. I think the problem is that we've become very confused by value. There's this sort of puzzling array of Google search results sort of suggests, actually, kind of all the different ways that we can think about value. It's striking that the first thing that Google suggests links architecture and value straight away. But in what way? What way do we, what is the value of a house? Clearly, the value of having a house compared to living on the street is gigantic. If that house becomes a home, somewhere that can rouse feelings of belonging and express the best qualities of ourselves back to us, that has a sort of immeasurable value. But I don't think either of those kind of values is what Google is kind of getting at with this suggestion. So the title, The Value of Nothing, comes from an Oscar Wilde book called Lady Windermere's Fan. And in that book, the character Lord Dartington is asked, well, what's a cynic? And he says, a cynic is someone who knows the value of nothing, but the price of everything. And it's really that relationship that I want to kind of explore through architecture, is like, what is the transaction between price and value? So, these are rye, not the house, that stone in front of it. They're the largest coins in the world. Some are 4 meters in diameter. They weigh several tons. They are from the Micronesian island of Yap. And the Yappies carve their currency from these vast boulders, driving holes through the middle to make kind of gigantic stone donuts. And dotted around these islands are these rocks. They might not look like it, but they function in kind of the same way as the notes in your wallet or the numbers in your bank account, in your online bank accounts. There's more than 6,000 of them in existence, and they've been exchanged for everything from livestock to property to part of dowry payments and so on. Interestingly, their physical location doesn't change, so it doesn't matter if they're outside your house, deep in the jungle, or even underwater. What matters is who can lay claim to their worth. As long as the Yappies agree that they have value, then they do. They're kind of the same as any money. They're a kind of physical abstraction of a social contract between people, that I can suspend my disbelief that this rock has any kind of intrinsic value and behave as if it did, because I can be confident that in the future someone will extend me the same favor. If overnight we all decided that krona were valueless, or the Yappies decided that the rye were valueless, their value would evaporate because they have no intrinsic value. And I think today, architects are kind of merchants of value. This is how we tend to sell ourselves. If you talk to a developer and you say, why do you bother to employ architects? Even a good developer will say, well, they add value. And if you go to MIPIM or sort of similar property fairs, you will see panels full of architects sort of boasting about how their design skills add value to projects. And yet, despite its centrality to architectural labour, value seems to be kind of absent from why people pursue architecture in the first place. Who here has ever interviewed somebody for a job in architecture or for university entry? I imagine some of you have. And I imagine you've probably asked the question at some point, so why architecture? And I suspect that most architecture students or wannabe architects don't say, oh, well, I just have this burning desire to add value to someone's property portfolio. They probably say something like, I went to the Reichstag in Berlin and I was struck by the power of architecture to heal a broken nation after years of totalitarianism. They say something lofty. They say something profound. They say people live in squalid conditions. They don't have access to good public spaces. They don't have access to light. I want to do architecture so I can help people, so I can lift their spirits, to lift civic society. They don't want to add value necessarily. And I guess this speaks to this fact that in our profession there is a gulf between the tactics on which we thrive as business people and the things that make what we do seductive and meaningful in the first place. And I think this is true for much of capitalism. So take this iconic Patek Philippe advert. In it we see a very handsome father and his son, we presume, sailing through a tranquil bay. The father we assume is an experienced sailor because he's not wearing a life jacket, whereas his son is, teaching him how to tie a knot. Now, I find this image incredibly seductive. It speaks of a life well lived. It speaks of the loving trust of a child, someone who hasn't got any kids, perhaps even more seductive. It speaks of aging well, of kind of passing down skills through generation. It even sort of defies death. The tagline, "Begin your own tradition," suggests that things can live on beyond us even after we've died, through our children and through traditions. All lovely, wonderful stuff, the essence of a good life. And yet, the product at the end of this advert is a mechanical watch and a pair of cufflinks. Things which, I'm sure they're very nice, but in no way can they satisfy the much deeper promise that the advert has sort of set up. The gulf between what is being sold and the product at the end of it is gigantic. But again, as with this sort of Bjarke Ingels' power station, in a way, this should be encouraging. This suggests that we know what we need, we know what makes a good life, we just haven't figured out, under this particular capitalist economy, how to manufacture those things. So So let's take a sort of, I guess what this sort of speaks to is the fact that we are just fundamentally confused about the difference between value and money, difference in value and price. We've kind of blended them together to such a point that it's become really hard to navigate the difference and know when we're talking about something's kind of financial value and something's sort of true value. There's an infinite number of ways that something can be valuable. Just going to drink some water. Sorry, hold on. There's an infinite number of ways that something can be valuable. It could be considered important or precious. It could help to express something that's hard to put into words, as a sort of great work of art does. It could protect us from something dangerous, or fortify our bodies, or enrich our spirit. And yet, whenever we try to kind of compress all those things and express them as pounds and pence, or krona, or rye, or whatever, somehow the kind of rich tapestry of values that, as architects, we weave gets kind of frayed and torn, becomes harder to appreciate. Now, there's in kind of economic anthropology, this is called general purpose money. It's a term which means a kind of currency that can be exchanged for anything of equivalent value. And this is this idea is kind of at the backbone of my critique, because I have this hunch that a lot of architecture is striving to be more and more like a form of general purpose money, like a kind of currency. I'm going to try and the price of a building is often determined not by its kind of intrinsic qualities, not by the lushness of the material or the exuberance of the design as such, but to what extent it can be converted into another kind of commodity. So architectural decisions about form and structure and program are often made with the question of how each choice will impact on the price of the project's performance in a kind of retail real estate market, rather than how it expresses a particular architectural idea. Like gold bars, like Bitcoin, like certain works of art, architecture has become a kind of investment commodity, good at moving money around, good as an investment opportunity, somehow less good at its deeper purpose. I'm going to give some British examples of how this plays out. This is a screenshot of central London. All of the buildings you can see marked in orange and purple are owned through tax havens based overseas. Now, why do you own a building through a tax haven? Well, you do it because it is part of your ledger and you're trying to reduce your financial outgoings as a property holder. So all of these blobs, and this is like, you know, quite a lot of London, is operating as part of someone's property portfolio empire. And you don't just have to look at tax havens. What's striking is this is I'm sorry for like showing you spreadsheets, but I think sometimes you do have to dig into the data a bit. This is a list of housing estates that have been sold in one borough of London, which has over 30 boroughs, sold recently, and who they've been sold to. So you have the percentage of overseas investors here, which is the kind of key one I want to focus on. Because overseas investors are buying flats not because they're going to live in them themselves. They might not even be going to rent them out to someone who lives locally. They're buying flats because they see them as a form of bank, somewhere to keep your cash. They see them as a form of general purpose money. Interestingly, or rather alarmingly, these percentages are very high. I don't know if you can see from the back there, but we have like 76%, 96%, 88%, 100%, 100%, 100%. So huge chunks of new housing in London is going straight into the investment portfolio of some investor somewhere in the world. And in fact, not just somewhere in the world, but jurisdictions where there's a high chance of corruption. So this shows the beneficiaries, the purchasers, and how many of them have come from a place where there's a high chance of corruption. You've got like 44%, 39%, 42%. So this is not good news. And of course, this phenomenon is not just felt in accounting terms and underpopulation in the city, but it has a spatial and aesthetic consequence as well. So let's look at an example. Circus West, phase 1 of Battersea Power Stations redevelopment, 85% sold to overseas investors, half of which transactions at risk of corruption. And this is the architecture that has appealed to those investors. It's anodyne, it's charmless, it's high emissions, it's low joy. It has almost no civic contribution, either in its ownership or in its spatial and architectural manifestation. Now, Alf Hornburg, who's a professor of human ecology at Lund, he argues that this tendency to push everything towards general purpose money, or liquid architecture, architecture that's easy to turn into cash, is not just kind of makes for bad design, but it's one of the underlying causes of most destructive aspects of the contemporary global economy. So just by having rainforests and Coca-Cola in the same marketplace, it makes it possible to make environmentally disastrous trade-offs. And so I guess the question of addressing value is not just putting an end to these kind of crazy practices, but it's about it's essential to how we approach environmental architecture in general. So I trained at Cardiff as an architect ages ago now, and I did so because even as an 18-year-old, I kind of had a hunch that Cardiff was kind of good. They were on the good side. They had good sustainability credentials. They knew about the sun. They'd heard of wind. It was, you know, all good. They have this amazing like light dome which simulates any sky in the world, and you take your kind of shit little first-year model into the light dome, and they show you what it would look like if it was in, you know, London or something. Exciting. So I was kind of optimistic, and you can imagine my disillusion when all of this research energy turned into this. So this is the Salsa House. It's the UK's first carbon net zero house. It produces more energy for the grid than it absorbs. It is accomplished with the combined wisdom of the entire University of Cardiff. It uses a sort of a system similar to Passive House. It's kind of a very, very controlled interior, lots and lots of layers, sort of plastic bag wrapped around the outside, and then using mechanical ventilation to control the interior environment. This is a disaster. This is architecture that works by sealing humans away from nature in artificial bubbles and creating a kind of micromanaged air system that relies on computers to work. It is completely unscalable. It sort of sees humans and the natural world as fundamentally antagonistic entities, that we just can't have a relationship with the natural world without that being mediated, in this case, by machine learning. It is horrible, both formally and in spirit. How could architecture this ugly ever galvanize the kind of popular support, the creative imagination, and importantly, the political will to seriously address climate change? It acknowledges some kinds of value, the value of energy efficiency, but it doesn't speak to a sort of deeper sense of values. It doesn't speak to our situation in relation to nature. Because I believe that architects don't just assemble a collection of elements in a kind of useful way. Value is deeper than that. We create something that, at best, nurtures us emotionally, bringing delight and solace. It helps people to feel the presence of beauty in the world. It helps us to feel peace, to be at peace, or to arouse civic duty or a sense of belonging. It can be playful, it can be serious, it can be threatening. But when these effects are measured as pounds and pence, this rich tapestry all unravels. So what if we could unpack this understanding of value and money? What if we could skip the mental leap from one to another? Perhaps it would allow us to make richer architecture. Perhaps if architecture didn't need to be measured in pounds and pence, if it didn't need to be liquid, perhaps it wouldn't tend towards the average. Perhaps it wouldn't make appalling design decisions. Perhaps it wouldn't be made from highly processed, low entropy components and materials. Perhaps it wouldn't be subjugated by its role in someone else's economic project. Perhaps it wouldn't be locked into perpetuating environmental breakdown. I'm going to talk a little bit about economics. Economics is, like, I think there's a tendency to think of economics as like a thing, as a real thing that has like immutable forces like the weather or gravity. And this makes it quite hard to deal with. But really, at a very, very basic level, economics is just a social science. It is a way of looking at and theorizing about how humans interact and coming up with strategies to help them manage their relationships, to manage things like trade and labor. And just as when we, in architecture school, talk about different material strategies, different architectural languages, when we talk about economics, we should talk about different kinds of economy, different models for assessing value, different ways of managing and structuring worth and relationships. So I think the mistake we often make is to assume that this economy, the one we have today, is the only option available, rather than just like one of many, many options that we just happened to pick. There's sort of some good reasons for it. But so a neoliberal economy, which is kind of what this guy, Friedman Hayek, set up, is broadly a liberal economy. It sort of says that value is just what happens to be valued. It's what is most desired. So it doesn't matter what the intrinsic qualities of a thing are. What matters is how much people are craving it. Marx had a different idea of value. His idea of value was more to do with labor. So something was valuable if it had a lot of labor put into it. And famously, he talked about a coat being an equivalent value to 20 yards of linen. And there's much more material in the 20 yards of linen, but the coat has had more labor put into it through all its tailoring, and so they can be thought of as an equivalent in value. Different kinds of economists pursue different strategies. So feminist economists might be interested in gender awareness and inclusivity. They might be interested in revaluing the kinds of thing that have been devalued by patriarchy over many years. So forms of labor like childcare, care for the elderly, domestic labor, emotional labor, and community work. And this is essentially what we're trying to do with the Oslo Triennale, is to say, okay, what if we were exploring other kinds of economy? What then would be the consequences for architecture? Because ultimately, if you have a different kind of economy, it will have a different set of values, and that will lead to different architectural decisions. And I think a small example of this that will be on show in Oslo is the practice Edit Collective. So Editor, interested in the distinction between private domestic work and public professional work. And they imagine a parallel timeline where domestic labor has never been confined to the private realm, but is rather undertaken collectively, as it sort of was in the past. And so in this parallel timeline, there is no market for domestic cleaning utilities that are for only used by one person at a time. But there is a market for kind of cleaning tools that can be used by many people, and so their contribution is a Hoover for 3 people, a vacuum cleaner for 3 people to use at once. It's a provocation, something to start a conversation, but that parallel timeline is kind of closer than you think. If you think of the heating up of water, which I'm sure it's different around the world, but in the UK it used to very much be domestic labour that was done by women on their own in the home, and it was drudgery and it was rubbish work, and it involved collecting coal and lighting a fire and then heating up water, whether that was for laundry or washing or cooking or whatever. And then in the 20th century it starts to shift, and the heating of water moves from the domestic sphere to the public sphere. It becomes professionalized. Boiler makers become a profession. Interestingly, it shifts from being female work to male work. And this kind of reaches a peak with the work of Erno Goldfinger, who at Trellick Tower gives the boiler room the highest status in the entire building. Domestic heating of water has shifted from being hidden and private to being public and celebrated through architecture. So is it such a stretch to imagine that cleaning could also be given a similar kind of status in society if we were to think more like feminist economists? So how would we change such a paradigm? How would we shift away from the current one and explore other forms of economy and how they play out in architecture? How could different social values produce new, different architectural values? Well, in fact, the kind of hints of a post-liquid form of architecture are actually already abundant. They're everywhere we look, quietly flourishing around the world. I'm going to talk a little bit about the infrastructure of sharing, then the architecture of repair. So in the Netherlands, for example, Humanitas Deventer is an experimental intergenerational retirement home where young people, sort of students and young professionals, live pretty much for free in the retirement home. And they, instead of paying for that with money, they pay for it by spending some time with the old people. This is a kind of, there's things you can criticize about this model, but essentially it is taking rent out of a monetary economy and making it a different kind of value exchange that's going on between the renter and the landlord, while enabling students to live without so much debt, without getting into mortgages and so on. Libraries of things are another example. This one's in Oxford, but they're very simple. It is where, as well as borrowing books, you can borrow stuff. Camera equipment, cooking equipment, specialist power tools, that you only, things that you don't need every day, but you do need every now and then. Instead of needing to buy one yourself, you go and borrow one from a library of things. In Akron, in Ohio, you can borrow any shape of baking tray, for example. In Oslo, you can borrow skiing equipment to go cross-country skiing. In Bergen, you can borrow fishing rods. In the Crystal Palace Library of Things in London, you can borrow waffle machines. So sharing through membership of a lending institution is one way where we can bring down the barrier to participating in some of these amazing activities that's usually has quite a high entry fee because you maybe have to afford this kind of expensive piece of equipment. But it's bad for the economy, right? The more we share, the less we need to buy. And the less we buy, the less trading goes on, which ultimately brings down GDP. So it's an interesting example of where something that we assume and we know to be enriching, sharing stuff amongst friends, either through an institution or not, is actively undermining the thing that we say society is based on, which is that GDP should always grow and nothing should threaten GDP. This is where my slides are in slightly the wrong order. But let's just plow on. Maybe, I mean, those are examples of kind of conventional architecture being used in unconventional ways, right? They're sort of normal buildings, but there's some sort of clever twist that's going on. But what if architecture itself could start to decouple value from price? And for this bit, I want to talk about the potential of repair as a kind of revolutionary concept. So I remember being in architecture school in Cardiff, and someone from the Danish firm C.F. Muller came to present their work on the Natural History Museum, which is this amazing, is the Darwin Centre, this kind of amazing concrete egg. It's absolutely gigantic, and it's filled with kind of laboratories and things. And they described it as an extremely sustainable project. And I thought, that's slightly odd. And so I asked him afterwards, you know, why do you call this a sustainable project? It seems like it's made of loads and loads of concrete. And he said, well, the thing you don't understand, Finn, is that, yes, it's made of lots of concrete, but it's going to last for 200 years. So you have to average out the carbon emissions of that concrete over 200 years. And that gives you your per year amount, which is very, very low. So don't focus on what it emits on day one. Spread it out over 200 years. Of course, we know he's wrong. We know he's dead wrong because we don't have 200 years. The IPCC has pointed out that actually there are these tipping points and that the first of these tipping points is 12 years away. So the idea that we can kind of justify a huge amount of emissions because a building is going to last for a very long time no longer stacks up. And the implications for this new reality are kind of totally profound. And I don't think they've yet started to sort of sink in, because all of the kind of moral value that we place on material strategies is based around hard-wearingness, solidity. This will endure the elements. This is tough. And if we can only achieve those things by kind of front-loading carbon emissions, then maybe those are things that we might need to get rid of as kind of moral values in our material choices. Longevity, hard-weariness, solidity, they might have had their time. There is a new bottom line, which is simply as little emissions as possible now. Doesn't matter what's happening in 200 years' time. But I sort of, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking like, this is what regulations are for, Finn. And in Sweden, you seem to have much more regulatory requirements than most European countries. So like, can't we just like let the regulations do the heavy lifting? Why do we have to like worry about this so much? We have enough to worry about as it is. And I'm not going to say that that building standards are the problem, but I think there maybe is a problem with building standards. As any school teacher will tell you, if you teach a kid just to pass the exam, they might get a good grade, but you're probably robbing them of a more holistic way of thinking that will come back to bite them later in life. So sometimes just kind of thinking about the certification and meeting the regulatory framework is the last thing we want to be doing. And I want to like look at a story through this. So this is Bloomberg. We talked a bit about Bloomberg earlier. It's the most sustainable office building in the world. It's got the highest BREEAM rating you can get that any building has ever got. BREEAM is the British building regulatory framework. Let's watch, surely if there is a building that can do what it needs to do to stop global warming being more than 1.5 degrees, this is it. Well, maybe it's not. Let's see if this works.
Sadly, all this is not enough. We've been working with the United Nations, and the first task that we carried out was producing a visual interpretation of the Paris Agreement. And as you know, the Paris Agreement, one of the demands it makes is to limit the increase in worldwide temperature to no more than 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 degrees from now. So all countries now have a standard by which they measure buildings. But as you can see here, the standards are very similar across the world. They mean the same sort of thing. And the high-grade, well-performing buildings, like I've been talking about, probably achieve only a 3-degree or 4-degree or 5-degree, or do achieve that amount of increase. It's too much.
Did you spot? So that's Spencer de Grey. He's head of design at Foster & Partners. He led the construction of the Bloomberg building with Mike Bloomberg and the team. There's sort of no one more qualified than him to talk about the success or failure of the Bloomberg building. And he has helpfully marked Bloomberg on his graph as a 3 degrees plus building, which rather gives the game away that even Spencer de Grey knows that the Bloomberg building is delivering, is like contributing to global warming more than double of what we can kind of afford. I don't know if we need tougher regulations. I suspect we don't. I suspect we need a whole different approach, and that we can't kind of force a solution through a regulatory framework. Spencer disagrees. He thinks that we need we kind of ramp up these levels to a much higher standard. What I do know is that we need to do a much better job than Bloomberg did, and that we need to do something much more vivacious and spiritually uplifting than that Salsa House I showed you earlier. Some people think this is a kind of disaster for architecture, that this is like the end of design, because all decisions must be made now in relation to their ecological impact, and there's no fun left in it. I think the opposite. I think this is the biggest and most exciting opportunity design has ever faced. I sort of, sometimes envious of the modernists who were faced with new technology and profound social problems, and they took those situations and turned it into the modern movement, which changed the world. And I sort of feel like we've got something similar coming up now. We know more than we've ever known before. We have new and old wisdom from like indigenous wisdom, but also new stuff that we're cutting edge. And we have this profound problem that we have to approach. So let's dig into, on those positive notes, the architecture of repair. So this is the ABAR map. It's from 1664. It's one of the oldest drawings of London. What's kind of interesting about it for me is the fabric of the city. Almost everything is made of wood and lime and cob and earth and wattle and daub and natural organic materials that are fairly insubstantial, that don't last for very long and need constant repair. And then every now and then there's like a castle or a church, which is made in a different way. It's made with stone. It is made with glass. It is made with slate, things that need to be quarried and processed to quite a long degree. And those buildings take a long time to make, so long that not a single person who starts on them will be able to see them finished. And I think, I'm not going to hold up medieval architecture as like a kind of model for us to adopt, but it does show a different paradigm where day-to-day buildings are made with materials that are kind of readily available, very, very low impact, but need some kind of love and care constantly. And then a couple of very special buildings are made extremely slowly, over generations, literally. And what would it mean to apply such a paradigm to contemporary architecture, to fall completely in love with repairing the city, to make an architecture that is constantly up for being eroded, but constantly able to be topped up? Because ultimately, it is better ecologically to grow a thatched roof and patch it up every 10 years forever than it is to make it out of concrete once. So thatch is kind of this amazing material. You see it all over the world. This is in Burgenland. This is in Switzerland. This is America, Bali, India, Germany, the UK, and so on. It's pretty much as widespread as people are. Anywhere that people and plants meet, thatch arrives. But it's not very used very often at the moment, and that's because it requires so much maintenance. This kind of thatched roof would require replacing every 10 to 15 years, and that kind of temporariness chips away at its ability to act as a liquid commodity. It kind of undermines architecture's status as general purpose money. It introduces risk, which banks don't like. It introduces uncertainty. It makes it inherently more complicated than a more fixed commodity. But what would it mean to kind of to not care, to like embrace that, to actually see that as a positive rather than as a detractor? It shouldn't be that hard to imagine, because if you think of the high-tech guys, they were building buildings that didn't require maintenance necessarily, but they required a lot of cleaning. And in the hands of Norman Foster and Richard Rogers and that whole gang, cleaning infrastructure, like this window cleaning crane, became architectural form. It is expressed in the architecture itself. Here again at the Lloyd's building, all of this is just cleaning infrastructure. This is this new tower in Blackfriars where the roof pops off and it lets down a cleaner. So if it's possible to express cleaning as architectural form, is it such a stretch to imagine expressing maintenance through architectural form? Maybe one way to think about this is at a civic scale. So this, you may know, this is the Great Mosque in Jenne in Mali. It's built out of mud bricks with then mud plaster on the outside. Torrential rains hit Mali every now and then, which washes off some of the mud plaster. But it doesn't matter, because every year the entire community come and replaster the outside of the mosque, which sort of reveals that these studs, they're like bound up rods of sticks, are not decoration or fortifications. They are physical, lasting infrastructure to enable the cleaning to take place. They are kind of permanent scaffolding for this ceremony that happens on an annual period. And this duality, both sign of repair and decoration, is something that we can see in other kinds of design world as well. So in Japan, this is borrow technique, where you it comes from like is it the Indo period in like the 17th, 18th, 19th century. We shouldn't romanticize it, because it's essentially peasants were very, very, very poor, and so would repair their garments very carefully with this kind of particular running stitch, and that they would be handed down through generations. So over time, a single jacket comes to resemble this extraordinary patchwork. I don't want to romanticize it, but it is interesting that the kind of the tactility and utility of this approach is strikingly different and quite seductive compared to our culture of fast, disposable fashion. Another Japanese example is kintsugi, the art of joining broken pottery using lacquer that's dusted with precious metals. I think, interestingly, as a philosophy, kintsugi treats breakage as part of the history of an object and something that should be on show rather than something that should be avoided or hidden. What would it mean to apply the logic of borrow or the logic of kintsugi to how we make and maintain buildings? What if acts of repair were not seen as annoying, but an opportunity to sort of make something different with a building? If pristineness, the kind of architecture associated with John Pawson, for example, became deeply unfashionable, and maybe it is already unfashionable, and other kinds of aesthetic expression became possible instead. These are kind of rarefied artisanal examples, but I think we could see another opportunity in from heavy metal, right? So the battle jacket is an interesting example. Battle jacket is like a leather or a denim jacket that you have for many, many years, and you add to it over time with studs and badges and patches from bands that you like, potentially worn for decades. They tell a complex tale of their wearers' music taste and their travels. They are, of course, they wear out, right? They get frayed. They're not very pristine. But somehow the aesthetic of heavy metal accommodates this and doesn't judge people for wearing a sort of slightly beat-up jacket. It actually is part of the culture. The studs, they're partly to make people look tough, but they're also to make the jacket tough, to make it more resilient to being worn for a long time. Could there be something in heavy metal that we could apply to architectural thinking? Maybe for repairs to be possible, they have to be more intuitive as well. Many contemporary houses are made in a way that it's quite hard to work out how you even would repair it, because circuits and plumbing and structures are kind of hidden away in boxes behind kind of complex wall build-ups. You don't know what is in your material, what is in the fabric of your buildings anymore. So there's a lesson I think we can draw from product design here. This is the work of Jesse Howard. These are transparent tools, and they're kind of very this is a kettle, that's a toaster, that's a vacuum cleaner. They're very kind of normal day-to-day appliances, but they're made in a way that tries to make it as obvious as possible how this thing works and how it goes together, so that if it breaks, you have a kind of, I reckon I could probably fix that. This all sort of seems simple. How different to like an appliance that you might buy in an electronics shop, which is all in a kind of plastic vacuum-formed case, has tiny screws with weird heads on, has like warning, don't open this, stickers on everything. Makes it very hard to even know what's going on, let alone have a sense that you might be able to fix it on your own. What this might mean for architecture, I don't know, but maybe it's as simple as expressing electrical cables and plumbing runs rather than boxing everything away and hiding things. Maybe it's as simple as information. Do you remember when cars used to come with like a big manual for every sort of bit in your car, and you could go like, this is how the engine works. And so if your car broke down, you could in theory, have a go at figuring out what was wrong. Now you need a sort of computer just to plug into the car to understand what's inside it. What if houses came with a kind of residence manual that enabled you to see what the walls were made of, enabled you to see where the plumbing was? I'm going to go back a bit. No, I'm not. I'm going to keep going. Or maybe there's another example again, which is repair as a kind of festival. So this is the Shinik and Sangu ceremony, again in Japan, every 20 years for 1,300 years. The people have rebuilt this shrine, and they do it in a kind of celebratory festival. The material is brought in, they take the old one apart, they build a new one. Now, you might think, that's a bit mad. Isn't using all that energy to sort of rebuild something that doesn't need rebuilding wasteful? Isn't it unproductive? And this brings me on to the kind of next section of my lecture, which is about time and how we use it. So hamsters, from birth, this is a baby hamster. They grow, they double in size every week from birth until puberty. If is it working? Yeah. If a hamster continued this rate of growth, by its first birthday, it would weigh 9 billion tons and be capable of consuming the entire global corn crop within less than a day. We kind of know that infinite growth is impossible. And yet, we base our economy, we base society on the idea that growth can continue forever. And I have bad news for you growth people, because it does seem like there is a big link between economic growth and carbon emissions. This kind of graph sort of suggests that. That's GDP down the bottom, that's CO2 emissions. In fact, the only year in the last 2 decades when global carbon emissions went down was in 2008-9. What happened in 2008-9? Massive economic global recession. So there's a bit of a problem here. Even if you could somehow decouple the carbon emissions, there are other problems too. Global growth is about 3% economically. It's sort of similar to global growth in energy consumption. 3% doesn't sound like very much, but that means doubling every 20 years or so. And if you double things, we know what happened with the hamster. Pretty soon, you can't sustain that for very long. You know the story about the rice on the chessboard, and he says, oh, I want 1 grain of rice on this this square, and then 2 on that square, and then 4 on that square, and then 8 on that square, and the emperor says, fine, go ahead. And then by the time you get to the last square on the chessboard, there's more rice on it than there are atoms in the known universe, or this kind of insane multiplier effect kicks in. And it's exactly the same with energy. Within a few hundred years, we would need an entire star to power our economy if we were growing at 3% a year for that entire period. And I don't mean the amount of energy that comes from the star. I mean the amount of energy that leaves the star. It is quite mind-boggling how fast things go up if you're doubling every 20 years. There's a sort of physical impossibility as well as a kind of moral imperative. And so I just want to kind of take a step back and think like, okay, if GDP is such a problem and if adding to it is a problem, then maybe being productive is part of the problem. Maybe we shouldn't aspire to be more productive. And I know that as architects that's hard, because architecture schools are a sort of hellscape of productivity, with tutors beating their students to be more productive. But perhaps it's not what society needs. It's certainly not what the planet needs. And that opens up new possibilities for architecture. Architecture that is wasting time. And I'm going to accelerate on the subject of wasting time, because I've clearly wasted too much of it in the early parts of this lecture. So these are the hears, which are this sort of series of trumpets around Kendleston Hall in the UK. What are they? They are auditory vistas. They're kind of ways of listening to the landscape like you might look at it from a viewing point. They are kind of opportunities, architectural opportunities to do very little at all. They are dépense machines. And if you remember one word from this lecture, remember the word dépense. It's central to a lot of degrowth thinking. And it literally means energy that you spend on stuff that is not productive, not economic. So you need to spend some energy on feeding yourself, on sleeping, on having, reproducing, on staying warm, blah, blah, blah. But then you have this surplus of extra energy, some of which you might invest in economically productive activities, like making the most efficient route from A to B. And the rest you might spend on dépenses, on things that are less productive. And it comes from this French philosopher Bataille. Bataille thinks that what to do with your surplus energy is the critical question that humans must answer. Going to skip that. And I think an interesting parallel to dépenses can be seen in play. And I want you to sort of think to yourself as you watch this video, what is this kid doing? Of course, it's the wrong question. He's not doing anything. Like, he's not planning any of those moves. He's playing. Psychologists call this particular kind of behavior deep play. And that clip is from a film that we shot for the Biennale a couple of years ago, that exploring deep play and how it works in adventure playgrounds. We often get this wrong as adults. We talk to children, we say, oh, I see you're doing, what are you doing? What are you making? And they kind of look at us like we're idiots, because we kind of are, because there's no objective in their mind. Play is its own reward. And I sort of feel like there's parallels we can draw to certain kind of folk traditions that kind of make no sense at all economically. This is maypoles. This is, common in Austria, but also in lots of places. English maypoles are smaller, but they have these ribbons on them that are very cool. And through dancing in the right way, you can weave these amazing, intricate structures. Is this a kind of metaphor for a kind of architecture that would allow us to waste time doing something wonderful? Here's another one from, this is going to be in the Triennale, this made by Hungarian architects who every year build the wind house to kind of mark the arrival of spring, which brings particularly strong winds to their part of the world. Tombstones are kind of interesting in this because unlike other kinds of sculpture, if you spend money on a tombstone, it's immediately worth nothing because you can't sell it to someone else because it's your tombstone, which is quite an unusual thing to do in our economy. This is Colin St. John Wilson's tomb, the architect who designed the British Library. It's It's like the gateway to the library. Sort of like a novelty tombstone, probably cost a lot of money, and yet has a lot of value to his family, probably to him at the end of his life, certainly to his fans. No economic value whatsoever. Gonna skip all that. Gonna skip all that. So I guess this is Amazon, right? This is what an Amazon warehouse looks like, and these are Amazon robots zipping around. I don't really mind Amazon robots at all. What I do mind is stuff like this. This is a patent that Amazon did for trackers that go on your wrists to monitor how humans are moving around. They do that so that they can make sure the humans are moving in the most productive way possible. This is an extension of the same idea. Now the human is in a cage. The cage is on a robot. And the robot does the moving, and then all the human needs to do is operate this mechanical arm. Again, this is being done in the name of productivity, bringing down prices. But I think it has completely lost touch with what it means to be human. It's completely lost touch with what it needs to work, with the essence of labor. I've got this whole section on materials, but I'm sort of out of time. So I'm going to skip the materials bit and shoot straight to the last slide, which is here. You can ask me later. So in a way, the final structure I want to share with you is the simplest of all, which is a cairn. Cairns are found all over the world. They mark sort of sacred spots and routes. They're made by travelers picking up a rock and placing it on the cairn as they pass. And what's amazing about cairns is that they kind of just arrive. Right? No one commissions them. No money changes hands. No one draws a plan and says the cairn shall go here and here and here. They just materialize from nothing. Potentially, this kind of wayfinding infrastructure emerges. And cairns, of course, can save your life. If you're lost in the fog and you can't find your way off the mountain and you see a cairn through the gloom, that's how you know what the route down is. And so I find that fascinating because in terms of economic value, they're worthless, right? You can't sell a cairn. No one owns a cairn. And yet what could be more valuable? And I kind of want to end on that note because I think it sort of sums up this problem of value quite eloquently and how we're just fucking confused. And maybe by rethinking the economy and rethinking our definition of value, we might be able to rethink architecture as well. Thank you.